Imagine a man so morally pure that even his enemies called him the Incorruptible. A man who lived in a modest rented room, who walked through the streets instead of riding in carriages, who once opposed the death penalty as a barbaric relic of tyranny. Now imagine that same man standing at the center of a revolution where the blade would fall so often that execution became routine, where the tribunals moved faster than justice and the city of Paris learned to measure time by the sound of steel. Maximilien Robespierre was not a conqueror. He was not a general. He did not hunger for gold or pleasure or fame. He hungered for virtue. He believed that a nation could be purified, that corruption could be cut away like infected flesh, that humanity could be corrected if only the will was strong enough. And when people failed to become virtuous, he did not abandon the dream, he sharpened it. He declared that virtue without terror is impotent and terror without virtue is fatal. And in that belief, he fused morality with execution. He was a lawyer who once refused to condemn a man to death and later helped construct a system where death became a civic instrument. He loved humanity so deeply that he lost patience with human beings. This is not merely the story of the reign of terror. It is the story of what happens when moral certainty becomes absolute power. Today we descend into the mind of the most controversial figure of the French Revolution, to understand how a serious child from Arras became the architect of the blade. The scaffold is raised, the crowd is silent, and the logic of virtue begins its descent. Imagine a boy who learned too early that stability is an illusion. A child who watched the structure of his world collapse before he understood the language of grief. Maximilien Robespierre was born in 1758 in the provincial town of Arras, but his psychological story truly begins in 1764, when his mother died and his father gradually vanished from his life, leaving behind 4 children and a silence that would never fully close. At 6 years old, he was not merely orphaned, he was repositioned. Childhood was replaced with responsibility, spontaneity replaced with gravity. His sister Charlotte would later describe him as serious, disciplined, prematurely adult, a boy who stopped playing and began observing, stopped laughing and began correcting. Something fundamental shifted inside him. He began to associate emotional vulnerability with abandonment, disorder with danger, and from that early rupture emerged a quiet obsession with structure, with rules, with moral clarity. He developed a temperament that was not playful but principled, not flexible but exacting. The world had shown him its instability, and he resolved never to be unstable himself. This was not ambition, it was self-preservation. The young Robespierre began to construct an internal architecture of certainty, a rigid framework where right and wrong were not negotiable, where loyalty was absolute, where moral deviation felt like existential threat. It was the psychology of a child who could not afford ambiguity, because ambiguity had already taken his parents. When he earned a scholarship to the prestigious Collège Louis le Grand in Paris at the age of 11, he entered a new arena of comparison, surrounded by the sons of nobles and wealthy families. He carried not resentment, but distance. He wore poverty like armor, austerity like identity. He immersed himself in the classics, Cicero, Cato, Brutus, men who had placed the Republic above themselves. He was drawn not to emperors, but to guardians of virtue, 2 figures who defended moral principle against corruption. Yet the thinker who shaped him most deeply was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose social contract proposed that beneath society's corruption there existed a pure collective will. The general will, a moral truth greater than individual desire. Robespierre did not merely read Rousseau, he internalized him. He absorbed the idea that humanity was naturally good but corrupted by institutions, that virtue could be restored through civic discipline, that the state could become an instrument of moral regeneration. This philosophy fused seamlessly with his childhood psychology. The abandoned boy who craved order found in Rousseau a blueprint for a purified society, a nation cleansed of selfishness, a republic governed not by privilege but by virtue. He began to see morality not as personal but collective, not as private but political. Returning to Arras in 1781 as a lawyer, he quickly developed a reputation for integrity. He defended the poor, refused bribes, and declined cases he deemed unjust. He even resigned from a judicial post rather than pronounce a death sentence, an act that appears almost ironic in hindsight. Yet at this stage, his opposition to capital punishment was rooted in principle. He saw it as a tool of tyranny, a relic of arbitrary authority. He believed law should elevate humanity rather than terrorize it. But even here, the pattern is visible. His empathy was directed toward humanity in abstraction, toward justice in theory. He loved the idea of the oppressed more than the complexity of flawed individuals. He was not socially warm, he was morally intense. Reserved, ascetic, emotionally distant. He did not indulge in pleasure, he did not seek excess. He lived modestly, almost monastically, and this lack of appetite gave him a reputation for incorruptibility. He had no visible weaknesses, no vices to exploit, no compromises to negotiate, and as the crisis of 1789 approached and the Estates General was summoned, this very rigidity would become his greatest asset. The French Revolution did not initially belong to Robespierre. When he arrived in Versailles, he was a minor deputy with a soft voice and rigid demeanor, overshadowed by more charismatic figures. Yet he possessed something the others lacked, unwavering consistency. While others shifted positions and sought compromise, he spoke relentlessly, hundreds of speeches over the coming years, each one reinforcing his image as the incorruptible defender of the people. He positioned himself as the guardian of the third estate, of the common citizen, of virtue itself. And in moments of political chaos, consistency appears as strength, inflexibility appears as moral clarity. He began to understand that revolutions are not only struggles for power, but performances of purity, and he performed virtue with absolute conviction. He did not bend because bending felt like betrayal. He did not soften because softness resembled the instability of his childhood. Gradually, he stopped being merely Maximilien Robespierre and became something symbolic, a vessel for the general will, a voice that claimed to speak not for himself but for France. And when a man begins to identify his own conscience with the conscience of a nation, disagreement ceases to be political and becomes moral deviance. The seeds were planted long before the terror began. They were planted in a childhood where order replaced affection, where principle replaced intimacy, where certainty replaced comfort. The revolution would give him the stage. But the script had been written decades earlier in the quiet rooms of Arras, in the silence left by a vanished father, in the disciplined solitude of a boy who decided that if the world was chaotic, then he would become its correction. And in that decision lay the beginning of a trajectory that would lead from moral idealism to mechanized terror. Because the same mind that cannot tolerate disorder in a household cannot tolerate disorder in a republic. And the same heart that confuses purity with safety will eventually attempt to purify everything that threatens its vision of order. The serious child of Arras did not set out to become an architect of fear. He set out to eliminate corruption, But when virtue becomes absolute, it leaves no room for humanity. And this tension between moral perfection and human imperfection would soon transform the incorruptible lawyer into the most feared man in France. The revolution was approaching, and the boy who feared chaos would soon be handed the power to remove it by force. When the Estates General was summoned in 1789, France was already trembling. Famine had hollowed the countryside, debt strangled the crown, and the old architecture of privilege was cracking under its own weight. Into this atmosphere of anxiety walked Maximilien Robespierre, a relatively unknown deputy representing the Third Estate of Arras. Small in stature, pale, precise in dress, soft in voice. He did not command attention by charisma, he commanded it by persistence. Among nearly 1,200 deputies, he was initially insignificant, overshadowed by men with booming voices and theatrical presence. Yet Robespierre possessed something rarer than charm. He possessed unwavering consistency. While others adjusted their language to circumstance, he spoke as though moral truth were fixed. As though compromise were contamination, he delivered speech after speech defending universal male suffrage, freedom of the press, the rights of Jews and Protestants, the abolition of slavery, positions that at the time appeared radical and uncompromising. He framed each argument not as negotiation but as principle, not as preference but as justice, and in the volatile environment of revolution, principle can sound like prophecy. He understood instinctively that revolutions are not won by moderation but by moral framing. If you define yourself as the guardian of virtue, then your opponents are forced into the role of corruption. And so Robespierre began to construct a political identity that was less individual and more symbolic. He was not simply Maximilien, he was the incorruptible. A man untouched by luxury, untouched by scandal, untouched by visible weakness. His modest lifestyle became political capital. His refusal to indulge became proof of purity. He positioned himself as the authentic voice of the people, particularly the sans-culottes of Paris, the working-class citizens who demanded bread and justice rather than constitutional nuance. While moderate revolutionaries sought compromise with King Louis XVI, Robespierre viewed compromise as regression. To him, the monarchy was not a negotiable institution but a moral contradiction. A republic could not coexist with a king because sovereignty could not be divided between virtue and privilege. His speeches grew sharper as the crisis deepened. He argued that the king's attempted flight from France in 1791 revealed an irreparable betrayal, that trust once broken could not be restored, that the survival of the revolution required clarity rather than hesitation. Gradually, the Jacobin Club, once merely a political society, became the arena where his influence crystallized. There he refined his rhetoric, turning abstract philosophy into mobilizing language, invoking Rousseau's general will as a sacred civic principle, suggesting that the people, when properly guided, embodied moral truth itself. This idea was intoxicating and dangerous, because once the general will is elevated above individual rights, dissent can be reinterpreted as treason. Robespierre's voice, though never physically imposing, carried the weight of inevitability. He did not shout, he reasoned. And in that calm reasoning lay a quiet absolutism. By 1792, the revolution had radicalized beyond reform. War with Austria and Prussia intensified paranoia, internal uprisings fractured unity, and the question of the king's fate loomed over the convention like a storm cloud. It was here that Robespierre crossed the threshold from idealist reformer to revolutionary executor. During the trial of Louis XVI, he delivered one of the most consequential arguments of his life. He insisted that the king could not be tried as a citizen because he was already condemned as an enemy of the people. To put him on trial as though he were merely mistaken would legitimize monarchy itself. Louis must die not as punishment, but as necessity. Not as vengeance, but as purification. The logic was chilling in its simplicity. If the Republic was to live, then the king must not. Robespierre had once opposed capital punishment as a barbaric relic of tyranny. Now he reframed execution as a civic act of self-preservation. This was not hypocrisy in his mind, it was evolution. He had come to believe that mercy toward systemic corruption was cruelty toward the people, that clemency could endanger liberty. When the king's head fell in January 1793, the revolution passed a point of no return. Europe recoiled, monarchies mobilized, France descended into war, both external and internal. And in moments of existential threat, societies gravitate toward certainty. Robespierre offered certainty. He argued that the Republic was surrounded by traitors, foreign armies at the borders, conspirators within, economic collapse looming, and that survival required discipline beyond normal law. It was in this crucible that the Committee of Public Safety emerged, a body granted extraordinary powers to defend the revolution. Robespierre did not immediately dominate it, but he understood its potential. If virtue was fragile, then it required guardianship. If the Republic was pure in theory, then it must be defended in practice. He joined the committee in July 1793, and with that step, his moral philosophy entered the machinery of state power. He still lived modestly, still dressed simply, still projected incorruptibility, but now his signature could mobilize armies and condemn suspects. He articulated a doctrine that would define his legacy, that terror was nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible, that it was an emanation of virtue. In his framework, terror was not chaos. It was order intensified. It was law sharpened. It was moral hygiene applied to a diseased body politic. This reframing was psychologically consistent with his childhood. Disorder had once threatened his family. Now disorder threatened the nation. And just as he had imposed discipline upon himself, he now sought to impose discipline upon France. Gradually, the distinction between protecting the revolution and purifying it blurred. Suspicion became preventative, accusation became defensive, and the machinery of surveillance expanded. Robespierre's belief in the general will require constant vigilance against corruption. But corruption is a concept without fixed boundaries. It expands as fear expands. And as France's crises deepened, so did his conviction that extraordinary measures were not temporary but necessary. The lawyer of Arras had become the moral center of a state under siege. And the same consistency that once made him admirable now made him immovable. He no longer adapted to events. He interpreted them as confirmation of his worldview. That virtue required force. That unity required elimination of dissent. That survival required severity. The voice of the revolution was no longer merely persuasive, it was decisive. And in that decisiveness lay the quiet transition from defense to domination, from justice to judgment, from the incorruptible advocate to the architect of the blade. The execution of Louis XVI did not stabilize the revolution, it radicalized it. When the blade fell in January 1793, it severed more than a monarch's head. It severed the last symbolic restraint on revolutionary escalation. Europe recoiled in horror. Monarchies that had once observed France cautiously now prepared for total war. Inside the country, civil uprisings erupted. most notably in the Vendée, where royalists and devout Catholics rose against the revolutionary government. The Republic was no longer reforming a nation, it was fighting for survival. And in moments of existential danger, the appetite for moderation collapses. Fear demands clarity, anxiety demands control. Robespierre saw in the expanding chaos confirmation of everything he already believed: that the revolution was surrounded by enemies, that virtue was fragile, that hesitation was fatal. The Republic had destroyed the king, but it had not destroyed corruption. In his mind, corruption had simply changed form. It was now hidden in hoarders, speculators, federalists, foreign sympathizers, lukewarm patriots, and those who questioned the pace of change. Suspicion became a civic instinct, and the Committee of Public Safety became the nerve center of national defense, granted extraordinary authority over military mobilization, economic controls, and internal security. The committee was not initially designed as an instrument of terror. It was conceived as a wartime necessity, but war alters moral thresholds. Emergency measures expand, temporary powers solidify, and the language of survival begins to override the language of liberty. Robespierre entered this environment not as a general but as a moral theorist. Yet theory applied to crisis becomes policy, and policy executed under fear becomes force. He articulated the idea that in a revolution the normal rules of peacetime justice no longer apply, that the Republic must defend itself with intensity equal to the threats it faces. In one of his defining formulations, he argued that the government of the revolution is the despotism of liberty against tyranny. This was not rhetoric of pleasure or cruelty. It was rhetoric of necessity. He did not describe terror as vengeance. He described it as justice accelerated. Justice stripped of delay, justice sharpened into immediacy. The Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris began operating with increased efficiency. Suspects were tried for crimes defined broadly as counter-revolutionary activity. Denunciations multiplied. Neighbors accused neighbors. Political rivals accused rivals. The machinery fed itself. Robespierre did not personally orchestrate every arrest, but his moral framing legitimized the structure. He provided the philosophical oxygen that allowed it to expand. If virtue is supreme and the Republic is virtuous, then opposition cannot merely be mistaken. It must be malignant, and malignancy must be removed. This logic, once accepted, becomes self-sustaining, because fear ensures compliance, and compliance appears as proof of righteousness. Yet even as executions increased, Robespierre maintained his image of austere simplicity. He lived in the house of the carpenter Maurice Dupe, occupying a modest room, eating plain meals, walking rather than riding. His lifestyle contrasted sharply with the caricature of tyrants. He possessed no palace, no mistresses, no visible luxuries, and this absence of personal indulgence strengthened his authority. He appeared incorruptible not only in speech but in habit, which made opposition more dangerous, because to criticize him was to appear aligned with selfishness. While other members of the committee, such as Danton or Hebert, displayed more flamboyant personalities, Robespierre radiated moral restraint, and restraint in a time of chaos resembles virtue. Yet beneath that restraint, the criteria for suspicion widened. Revolutionary justice became preventative rather than reactive. The law of suspects passed in September 1793 allowed for the arrest of individuals whose conduct, associations, or reputation suggested hostility to liberty. Reputation became evidence. Hesitation became proof, silence became guilt. This was the moment when fear embedded itself structurally into governance. Robespierre believed sincerely that the Republic was besieged and that extraordinary vigilance was essential. He did not experience himself as the architect of oppression. He experienced himself as the guardian of survival. Psychologically, this distinction mattered profoundly, because it allowed him to reconcile escalating violence with internal coherence. He was not betraying his principles. He was applying them. The Republic must be virtuous. Virtue must be protected. Protection requires severity. Severity requires enforcement, and enforcement requires power. By late 1793, France had begun to stabilize militarily. Victories on the battlefield reduced external threat. Yet internally, the momentum of suspicion did not recede proportionally. Once a government constructs a system designed for rapid elimination of enemies, the definition of enemy expands to justify the system's continuation. This is not necessarily the product of individual malice. It is the inertia of structure. Robespierre's speeches during this period grew more insistent. He warned against factions, against corruption within the revolution itself. He criticized those who called for leniency as naive or compromised. Clemency, in his formulation, was indulgence toward treason. An indulgence toward treason was cruelty toward the people. This reframing inverted traditional morality. Mercy became suspect, severity became compassionate, and the guillotine, once an emblem of horror, became described as an instrument of equality, swift and impartial, death without torture, justice without aristocratic privilege. The symbolism was powerful. The blade did not discriminate by birth. It fell equally. An equality in death could be presented as a form of civic leveling. Yet the psychological toll of constant execution accumulated. Paris lived under the shadow of the scaffold. The Place de la Révolution became a stage of ritualized finality. Crowds gathered not only in fear but in normalization. Repetition dulls shock, and what shocks at first becomes procedural. Robespierre watched this transformation and interpreted it through the lens of necessity. He believed that once the enemies of liberty were eliminated, peace would follow. That terror was transitional rather than permanent. That severity was a bridge to harmony. But history rarely obeys transitional intentions. Mechanisms designed for purification rarely dismantle themselves spontaneously, and the moral clarity that justified their creation often resists their limitation. The death of the king had removed the external symbol of tyranny, but it had also removed a stabilizing boundary. Now sovereignty rested abstractly in the people. An abstract sovereignty requires interpreters. Robespierre increasingly saw himself as one such interpreter, not because he sought dominance for its own sake, but because he believed he understood the moral trajectory of the revolution more clearly than his peers. He did not crave authority, he assumed responsibility. Yet authority assumed in the name of moral truth can become indistinguishable from control. And as 1794 approached, the revolution stood at a precipice, militarily improving, politically centralized. Morally intensified, the Republic had survived its first convulsions, but the logic that had sustained it was sharpening. And in that sharpening lay the approach of what would later be called the Great Terror. The next phase would not be defined merely by external enemies, but by purification within. And the incorruptible guardian would soon turn his gaze toward those who had once stood beside him. By early 1794, the revolution no longer trembled at the borders. It trembled within itself, External victories had reduced the immediacy of foreign invasion. The armies of the Republic were beginning to push back against the coalition, yet inside Paris a new tension emerged. If the Republic was no longer on the brink of military collapse, then what justified the continued severity of its internal discipline? This question divided the revolutionary leadership into factions. Some argued that the terror had served its purpose and should now soften. Others insisted that corruption had merely adapted and that vigilance must intensify. At the center of this conflict stood Robespierre, increasingly isolated, increasingly convinced that only unwavering virtue could preserve what had been achieved. He faced two opposing currents within the revolution. On one side, the Hebetes, radical populists who encouraged de-Christianization campaigns and street-level extremism. On the other, the Dantonists, led by Georges Danton, who called for clemency and a relaxation of emergency measures. To Robespierre, both tendencies were dangerous. The Hebetists threatened moral order through chaos. The Dantonists threatened it through softness. He believed the Republic must be both disciplined and pure, not anarchic and not indulgent, and so he moved decisively against both camps. First, the Hebetists were arrested and executed, accused of conspiracies and excesses that endangered the revolution. Their fall removed the loudest voices of radical agitation. Then his attention turned toward Danton, a former ally, a charismatic figure whose booming voice and appetite for life contrasted sharply with Robespierre's restraint. Danton argued that the revolution must show mercy to secure stability, that endless executions risked devouring its own legitimacy. But in Robespierre's moral universe, mercy detached from virtue resembled corruption. He suspected that Danton's calls for moderation concealed ambition or compromise. Whether these suspicions were grounded or exaggerated mattered less than the psychological framing. For Robespierre, disagreement had become indistinguishable from moral failure. The trial of Danton in April 1794 marked a decisive moment. Danton defended himself vigorously, accusing the committee of tyranny, attempting to appeal directly to public opinion. His confidence threatened the authority of the tribunal, and procedural rules were adjusted to silence him. When Danton mounted the scaffold, he declared that the revolution was eating its own children. The phrase lingered in the air as both warning and prophecy. With Danton's execution, the last significant internal counterweight to Robespierre's influence disappeared. Yet rather than consolidating calm, this elimination intensified anxiety among remaining deputies. If Danton could fall, then no one was secure. Robespierre did not celebrate these purges as personal victories. He justified them as surgical necessities. He argued that the revolution must be purified from within before it could secure peace without. But purification has no natural endpoint, because virtue is defined aspirationally rather than concretely. Any deviation from the ideal can be construed as contamination. And as the circle of acceptable opinion narrowed, fear expanded proportionally. Deputies who once applauded Robespierre now whispered cautiously, measuring their words, watching their alliances. The atmosphere of suspicion that had once been directed outward began to rotate inward. Robespierre himself appeared increasingly austere and withdrawn. He reduced his public appearances, spending time in reflection, walking alone, cultivating an image of contemplative severity. Some interpreted this withdrawal as exhaustion, others as calculation. Psychologically, it suggested strain. He had constructed a moral architecture so demanding that it left little room for human complexity, and maintaining such architecture under constant crisis required immense cognitive and emotional energy. Meanwhile, the machinery of execution continued. The Revolutionary Tribunal operated with heightened efficiency, and public tolerance for blood began to thin. Fatigue replaced fervor. Yet Robespierre responded not by retreating from principle, but by intensifying it. In June 1794, he orchestrated the Festival of the Supreme Being, an elaborate civic ceremony designed to anchor the Republic in a form of deistic morality. He believed that atheism bred cynicism and that a republic of virtue required spiritual elevation. On a staged artificial mountain in Paris, he appeared in a sky-blue coat, symbolizing renewal, and presided over a ritual that replaced the old church with a civic religion centered on virtue and reason. To supporters, it represented moral coherence. To critics, it resembled personal grandiosity. Some deputies began to fear that Robespierre envisioned himself not merely as legislator, but as moral prophet. The fusion of political authority and spiritual symbolism amplified unease. And only days later, he supported the law of 22, which streamlined judicial procedures, limited defense options, and expanded the range of capital offenses. Trials accelerated dramatically, acquittals became rare. Executions surged in what would later be called the Great Terror. Robespierre defended the law as necessary to defend liberty against conspirators, but many deputies interpreted it as an expansion of unchecked power, because it reduced procedural safeguards that might have protected them as well. The paradox of his position became acute. He insisted he sought only justice. Yet justice, under his framework, required extraordinary latitude. An extraordinary latitude under fear resembles arbitrary. Robespierre's speeches during this period grew more abstract. He spoke of virtue, of corruption, of conspiracies unnamed. On 8 Thermidor, he delivered a lengthy address hinting at traitors within the convention but refusing to identify them. He believed that moral pressure would expose the guilty. Instead, it unified the anxious. Deputies across factions realized that vagueness made everyone vulnerable, that survival required preemptive action. The logic of suspicion he had institutionalized now turned toward him. The very mechanism designed to eliminate enemies created an incentive for those who felt endangered to strike first. Robespierre underestimated this shift. He trusted that his reputation for incorruptibility would shield him, that the people would rise in his defense, but public enthusiasm had cooled. The constant rhythm of executions had eroded revolutionary romanticism. Bread remained scarce, war fatigue persisted, and the spectacle of purification no longer inspired but unsettled, as whispers solidified into coordination. Robespierre found himself isolated not because he lacked conviction, but because conviction had become threatening. The purge of the revolution had reached its logical culmination. When purification becomes perpetual, the purifier becomes suspect, and the system that enforces virtue begins to calculate its own preservation. The revolution that once elevated him as guardian of the people now prepared to redefine him as danger to the Republic. And in that pivot, the architecture he had helped construct revealed its final property. It did not require loyalty to individuals, only to survival. And survival in a chamber of fear demands sacrifice, even of the incorruptible. The revolution that had devoured kings, generals, priests, and patriots now turned its gaze toward the man who had most passionately defended it. On the 9th of Thermidor, July 27, 1794, the fragile equilibrium inside the National Convention shattered. Robespierre entered the chamber confident but tense, still convinced that moral clarity would prevail over fear. Yet the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. The deputies who once listened in disciplined silence now interrupted. Accused, shouted, voices overlapped. The authority of his tone dissolved beneath a rising wave of panic. When he attempted to speak, he was drowned out by cries of "Down with the tyrant." Irony hung heavy in the room. The man who had justified extraordinary measures in the name of protecting liberty now faced the accusation of threatening it. The convention voted to arrest him and his closest allies. Among them, his brother, Augustin, and the young Saint. Robespierre refused to accept the legitimacy of the decree. He believed the convention had been corrupted by conspirators. He turned toward the galleries, expecting popular support. But the response was muted. The people of Paris, exhausted by months of executions and economic strain, did not rise with the fervor he anticipated. That night he was taken into custody, yet confusion followed. Some municipal authorities, loyal to the Paris Commune, rejected the arrest order and freed him. He made his way to the Hôtel de Ville, hoping to rally resistance, hoping that the machinery of the revolution would defend its architect, yet hesitation plagued the effort. Hours passed, communications faltered, no decisive uprising materialized. Inside the Hôtel de Ville, tension thickened into dread. Robespierre and his allies waited as forces loyal to the convention gathered outside. Some time before dawn, a shot rang out. Robespierre was found with his jaw shattered. Whether he attempted suicide to avoid capture or was shot by a gendarme remains disputed. What is certain is that the wound silenced him. The man who had governed through the authority of speech was reduced to inarticulate agony. Blood soaked his collar, pain replaced rhetoric. He was carried back into custody, laid upon a table as a specimen rather than a statesman. Deputies who had once trembled at his moral condemnation now observed him with cold detachment. The reversal was swift and brutal. The incorruptible guardian was reframed as tyrant. The next day, July 28th, he was taken to the guillotine without formal trial, alongside 21 supporters. The crowd that gathered along the route expressed not the reverence once shown, but relief and hostility. When the executioner tore away the bandage from his wounded jaw, a scream escaped him. A final, involuntary sound from a man who had defined himself by reasoned speech. Then the blade fell, and with it the reign of terror effectively ended. Yet the immediate aftermath did not bring clarity, it brought reaction. The Thermidorian reaction dismantled the structures of extreme emergency governance. The Jacobin Club was closed, prisoners were released. Former collaborators distanced themselves from responsibility. Robespierre became the convenient embodiment of excess, the singular villain onto whom collective guilt could be projected. Men who had signed the same decrees now denounced his fanaticism. Psychological self-preservation demanded narrative simplification. It was easier to blame one incorruptible fanatic than to confront the systemic momentum that had enabled the terror. His body was thrown into a mass grave at the cemetery of Erens, covered in quicklime to prevent relics, an attempt to erase physical memory. Yet erasure rarely eliminates influence. In death, Robespierre became symbol rather than administrator. To some, he remained a martyr of principle, betrayed by cowards. To others, he stood as warning against moral absolutism armed with power. His fall exposed the fragility of revolutionary legitimacy. The same mechanisms that justified terror in defense of virtue could be redeployed to justify terror in defense of survival. Thermidor did not invalidate his logic, it redirected it. The convention framed its action as preservation of liberty against dictatorship, echoing his own language of protection against corruption. Thus, the revolution consumed its most austere guardian using his own vocabulary. The psychological arc was complete. The serious child of Arras who had sought order against chaos found himself destroyed by the chaos he could not fully control. His error was not greed, not decadence, not visible vice. His error was certainty untempered by flexibility. Once he equated his conscience with the general will, disagreement became moral deviation. And moral deviation under crisis became grounds for elimination. The paradox of his life lies precisely there. He began as a critic of arbitrary execution and ended as a facilitator of accelerated justice. He opposed tyranny and was executed as a tyrant. He loved the abstract people and alienated the living citizens. Thermidor demonstrated that revolutionary systems are unstable when morality and power fuse without procedural restraint. The fall of Robespierre did not erase the ideals of liberty and equality, but it forced France to confront the cost of pursuing them without institutional limits. The Directory that followed was less ideologically intense, more pragmatic, more corrupt, yet also less lethal. The fever broke, though scars remained. Historians would later debate whether Robespierre's severity saved the Republic from foreign domination or nearly destroyed it from within. But beyond policy debates, his life remains a psychological study of moral absolutism under crisis. The Incorruptible had sought to defend virtue through terror, yet terror eroded trust, and without trust, political legitimacy withers. On the scaffold, he became both victim and architect of the mechanism that ended him. His silence in those final hours stands as stark contrast to the eloquence that elevated him. And in that silence lies the final irony. Virtue proclaimed to rigidly confracture the very society it seeks to perfect. The revolution moved forward without him, but it carried forward the question he embodied. How far can a republic go in defending itself before it becomes indistinguishable from what it opposes? Thermidor answered not with philosophy, but with steel. And the man who once declared that terror was just as severe and inflexible was judged by the same severe inflexibility, leaving history to determine whether he was defender of liberty or its most disciplined executioner. With Robespierre's death, the executions slowed, the fever receded. Yet the psychological question remained unresolved. How does a man who begins as an advocate of rights become the defender of accelerated death? To understand this transformation, one must look beyond events and into structure. Beyond policy and into personality, Robespierre's life reveals a consistent internal architecture. An early rupture followed by the construction of rigid moral certainty. The loss of parental stability in childhood created an intolerance for unpredictability. Unpredictability in later years manifested as political instability, and political instability triggered the same compensatory instinct. Impose order, clarify boundaries, eliminate ambiguity. He did not drift gradually into cruelty. He moved step by step along a line of coherence. Each decision aligned with a prior belief. Virtue must be protected. Corruption must be removed. Hesitation is dangerous. Unity is survival. This chain appears logical when examined sequentially, which is precisely why it became powerful. There was no moment in which he declared himself tyrant. Rather, he defined tyranny as deviation from moral truth, and once he equated moral truth with his interpretation of the general will, the boundary between conscience and authority dissolved. Psychological historians often describe this pattern as moral absolutism fused with political power. When an individual's internal identity merges with an abstract ideal, any challenge to that ideal feels existential. Compromise becomes self-betrayal. Dissent becomes threat. Robespierre's opposition to capital punishment in his early career was sincere, yet it was grounded in opposition to arbitrary injustice. Once he redefined execution as defense of collective liberty, the contradiction resolved itself within his framework. He did not abandon principle, he reinterpreted it under crisis. This is the subtle danger of ideological consistency. Flexibility appears as weakness, and weakness in a revolutionary environment invites collapse. The Committee of Public Safety operated under extraordinary pressure: war, famine, insurrection. Yet the psychological mechanism that sustained emergency measures beyond immediate necessity was not simply fear. It was righteousness. Fear alone produces panic. Righteousness produces endurance. Robespierre believed he was acting as custodian of virtue, not executor of enemies. This belief insulated him from self-doubt. An insulation from doubt under power is profoundly destabilizing, because doubt functions as brake. Without it, acceleration continues unchecked. Another critical element was abstraction. Robespierre loved the people in concept, the general will as moral essence. Yet abstraction reduces individuals to representatives of categories: traitor, patriot, suspect, conspirator. Once individuals are converted into symbols, their elimination can be framed as correction rather than loss. This shift is not unique to Robespierre. It recurs in political movements across centuries. The prioritization of system over person, of ideal over complexity. He did not wake each morning desiring bloodshed. He woke desiring moral clarity. Yet clarity enforced without pluralism compresses society into binary judgment: virtuous or corrupt, loyal or treacherous. The law of 22 prairial exemplified this compression. By narrowing defense and expanding accusation, it operationalized suspicion. And once suspicion is institutionalized, it becomes self-validating. Arrests generate confessions. Confessions confirm threat. Threat justifies arrests. Robespierre's withdrawal during the height of the Great Terror suggests psychological strain. Some contemporaries described him as exhausted, others as contemplative. It is plausible that he felt the burden of sustaining ideological purity in a system increasingly defined by fear. Yet rather than retreat from principle, he intensified it, proposing the cult of the supreme being as moral anchor. This move illustrates another dimension of his psychology. He understood that revolutions destroy religious structure but leave spiritual appetite. He attempted to fill that appetite with civic virtue, effectively sacralizing the republic. When the state acquires sacred status, dissent acquires heretical status, and heresy historically invites punishment. Robespierre did not seek personal worship, yet the symbolic staging of the festival and his central role within it amplified perception that he embodied moral authority. Perception matters as much as intention in political dynamics. Deputies who once admired his incorruptibility began to fear its implications. If he alone defined virtue, then their safety depended entirely upon his judgment. Thus, his greatest strength became vulnerability. Incorruptibility without relational flexibility isolates. Isolation breeds suspicion on all sides. By the time of his final speech in July 1794, he hinted at conspiracies without naming individuals, perhaps believing that moral pressure would cleanse the convention. Instead, it unified disparate factions against him. Fear is cohesive when shared, and he had taught his colleagues the logic of preemptive elimination. The system he helped design did not require personal hatred to activate. It required survival calculus. And once survival calculus identified him as threat, the mechanism turned. Psychologically, the fall of Robespierre demonstrates that systems built on suspicion cannot indefinitely exempt their architects. Virtue as weapon eventually destabilizes its wielder. After his execution, France shifted toward pragmatism. The Directory embraced compromise. Corruption increased, but executions declined. The revolution moved from moral intensity to political negotiation. Some later revolutionaries would reinterpret Robespierre as martyr of principle, arguing that his severity saved the Republic from foreign domination. Others would condemn him as prototype of ideological terror. Both interpretations capture fragments of truth, yet the deeper lesson lies in structure. The fusion of moral certainty with concentrated power under crisis conditions generates acceleration toward exclusion. Once exclusion is normalized, elimination becomes administratively feasible. Robespierre's life illustrates how personal integrity does not guarantee political restraint. In fact, personal integrity combined with ideological rigidity can amplify intolerance for dissent. He was not corrupt in the traditional sense. He did not enrich himself. He did not indulge excess. His austerity was authentic, yet authenticity does not immunize against authoritarian drift when the definition of good is monopolized. The serious child of Arras sought order to defend against chaos. But societies require managed disorder to remain pluralistic, disagreement, debate, compromise. These appear messy, but they prevent concentration of moral authority in a single voice. The psychological tragedy of Robespierre lies in his inability to tolerate that mindset. He sought to remove instability rather than channel it, and in doing so, he narrowed the Republic's capacity for complexity. His story remains relevant, not because of guillotines, but because of its underlying pattern. Whenever political actors claim exclusive access to moral truth, whenever emergency justifies permanent exception, whenever abstract purity outweighs individual dignity, the logic he articulated reemerges. Virtue without restraint can become severity without limit, and the boundary between guardian and ruler blurs. Robespierre did not invent this pattern, but he embodied it with rare intensity. His rise and fall serve as enduring case study in how the pursuit of perfection under pressure can produce the opposite of its intention, and how the incorruptible, in striving to defend the revolution from enemies, ultimately exposed it to the consequences of its own uncompromising logic. When the blade fell on Robespierre, the terror did not vanish overnight, but its momentum fractured. The deputies who had feared for their lives now moved swiftly to dismantle the machinery that had threatened them. The Committee of Public Safety was restructured. Its powers diluted, the Revolutionary Tribunal slowed, and the law of 22 prairial was repealed. Yet the Thermidorian reaction was not a simple return to moderation. It was a defensive recalibration driven by survival instinct. Those who had participated in the terror sought distance from it. Reputations were rewritten in weeks. Former allies denounced Robespierre as singular architect of cruelty, as though severity had emanated from one man rather than a network of consent and fear. The Jacobin Club was closed, its halls, once echoing with rhetoric of virtue, now silent. Symbols of radical egalitarianism were stripped away. Price controls relaxed, political prisoners were released, and a new elite emerged, more pragmatic, more comfortable with compromise, less willing to invoke moral absolutism as justification for extraordinary measures. Yet the retreat from ideological intensity did not restore innocence. It replaced fever with fatigue, and in that fatigue, corruption found room to breathe. The Directory that followed was marked by instability, economic turbulence, factional intrigue, and increasing reliance on military authority to maintain order. The revolution's moral flame dimmed, but the Republic survived. Robespierre's fall exposed the volatility of revolutionary legitimacy. When sovereignty resides abstractly in the people, it requires institutional safeguards to prevent its monopolization. Thermidor demonstrated that even those who champion popular will can be displaced when fear consolidates against them. The reaction also revealed a deeper psychological dynamic. Collective guilt seeks container, and Robespierre became that container. By attributing excess to his personal fanaticism, the convention absolved itself. This narrative simplification stabilized politics temporarily, yet historians have long debated its accuracy. The terror was not the product of one will alone. It was sustained by war. Scarcity, ideology, local denunciations, and bureaucratic momentum, but history often prefers faces over systems. And Robespierre's face, pale and severe, became emblem of excess. In death he transformed from administrator to myth. For conservatives he represented warning against radical equality. For later socialists he symbolized incorruptible commitment betrayed by opportunists. In the revolutions of 1830 and 1848, some radicals reclaimed his name as martyr of principle, contrasting his austerity with the corruption of post-Thermidor leadership. This oscillation between demonization and sanctification illustrates how political memory operates. Figures of intensity rarely remain neutral. They are recast according to contemporary need. Yet beyond myth, the structural lessons persisted. Thermidor signaled a shift from revolutionary purity to institutional survival. But it did not erase the conceptual tools Robespierre had sharpened. The language of emergency, the appeal to collective virtue, the suspicion of internal enemies, these tools remained available to future actors. The French Revolution itself continued, reshaping constitution after constitution, eventually culminating in the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose consolidation of authority demonstrated another pathway from instability to concentrated power. Napoleon did not invoke virtue in the same moralized tone as Robespierre, but he benefited from the exhaustion produced by moral extremity. Citizens weary of ideological oscillation often accept strong leadership promising stability. Thus, the arc from terror to empire reveals an unintended consequence. Excessive moral purification can generate appetite for order at any cost. Robespierre had feared chaos above all. Yet the chaos of factional purge and retaliatory reaction contributed indirectly to the conditions, enabling authoritarian consolidation. The Thermidorian leadership framed its actions as restoration of liberty. Yet it also curtailed democratic participation, suppressing radical clubs and limiting popular influence. Liberty survived but narrowed, and political power increasingly migrated toward those with military leverage. This shift underscores another irony. Revolutions initiated in the name of equality can conclude with hierarchical stabilization when fatigue overtakes fervor. Robespierre's absence did not eliminate tension between virtue and pragmatism. It merely repositioned the balance. His life became cautionary tale, cited in debates over emergency governance. Some argued that his severity preserved the Republic during existential threat. Others countered that it undermined the revolution's moral legitimacy. The truth lies within a complex interplay of contingency and conviction. External war amplified fear. Fear amplified suspicion. Suspicion amplified polity, and policy institutionalized acceleration. Thermidor interrupted but did not fully resolve this chain. Instead, it demonstrated the vulnerability of systems that concentrate moral authority without procedural checks. Deputies who had survived Robespierre understood viscerally that legal ambiguity combined with political fear is combustible. Thus they prioritized self-protection through diffusion of power. Yet diffusion without coherence invites instability, and instability invites consolidation elsewhere. The psychological atmosphere of post-Thermidor France was marked less by triumph than by relief. Relief that the immediate threat of denunciation receded. Relief that public executions slowed. Relief that ideological scrutiny softened. But relief carries its own risk. It can obscure structural reflection. The revolution moved forward carrying unresolved questions about sovereignty, justice, and the permissible boundaries of defense. Robespierre's name lingered in pamphlets, speeches, and memories, invoked as warning or inspiration depending on context. His incorruptibility remained undeniable, his rigidity equally so. And the Thermidorian reaction institutionalized a collective lesson. Concentrated virtue enforced by concentrated power is unstable. Yet the desire for moral clarity never disappears from political life. It re-emerges under new banners, new crises, new leaders. The aftermath of his fall thus serves not as conclusion but as transitional chapter in a broader narrative about how societies negotiate fear, principle, and authority. The revolution survived Robespierre, but it could not entirely escape the logic he articulated. That survival sometimes demands severity, that unity sometimes demands exclusion. The challenge for future generations would be determining how to preserve liberty without reproducing the conditions that justified terror. Thermidor provided temporary answer through dispersion, yet dispersion introduced its own vulnerabilities, and the oscillation between intensity and moderation became recurring rhythm in modern politics. Robespierre's story, therefore, extends beyond his execution. It permeates debates about emergency powers, about the balance between rights and security, about the moral responsibility of leaders who claim to speak for the collective good. His fall reminds us that revolutionary systems are self-correcting only when fear converges against concentration. But it also warns that fear, once normalized, remains latent, awaiting conditions that reactivate it. The Thermidorian reaction closed one chapter of blood, yet it opened a prolonged inquiry into how republics defend themselves without dissolving into the severity they oppose. And that inquiry continues wherever ideals confront crisis and certainty confronts complexity. After Thermidor, the body of Robespierre dissolved into quicklime. But the argument he embodied refused burial. Ideas do not decompose with flesh. They circulate, reinterpret themselves, reappear in altered climates. And the legacy of Robespierre became less about the man and more about the logic he articulated. Future revolutionaries across Europe studied the French Revolution not merely as history but as manual, a laboratory of success and failure, and within that laboratory, Robespierre stood as both warning and prototype. To some 19th century radicals, he represented incorruptible devotion to equality, a man who would not compromise with aristocracy or wealth, a figure who placed the poor above the privileged and refused personal enrichment. His austerity contrasted sharply with the corruption that followed the terror, making him appear, in retrospective imagination, as a martyr of principle betrayed by opportunists. Yet others interpreted him differently, seeing in his career the blueprint for ideological absolutism. The demonstration that when political virtue is defined narrowly, it requires enforcement broadly. This dual interpretation persisted because Robespierre's life contained both elements: genuine commitment to equality and genuine intolerance for dissent. The tension between these elements mirrored the broader tension within modern revolutionary thought. Can justice be secured without coercion? Can equality be defended without severity, or does transformation require force? Later, political movements wrestled with these questions explicitly, some citing Robespierre as example of moral courage under siege, others citing him as caution against purity unrestrained. During the Russian Revolution, for example, leaders such as Lenin examined the French experience closely, analyzing its stages, factions, and failures. While contexts differed dramatically, the conceptual parallels were striking. Emergency committees, rhetoric of internal enemies, acceleration of justice in defense of revolution. Lenin admired aspects of Jacobin discipline, yet he also sought to avoid what he perceived as their organizational weaknesses. Robespierre thus became historical reference point in debates over centralized authority and revolutionary survival. Similarly, in the 20th century, ideological regimes often justified extraordinary measures by invoking existential threat and moral necessity. Though direct lineage should not be overstated, the resonance is clear. Once a movement defines itself as embodiment of collective will, it faces temptation to suppress divergence as betrayal. Robespierre's articulation of terror as justice prompt, severe, inflexible, echoes in political language whenever leaders frame harsh policy as protective rather than punitive. His legacy also shaped liberal thought. Critics of concentrated power frequently cited the terror as example of how noble aims can devolve into repression when institutional safeguards erode. Constitutional theorists emphasized separation of powers, procedural guarantees, and limits on emergency authority precisely to prevent recurrence of concentrated moral governance. In this way, Robespierre influenced both advocates of radical transformation and architects of restrained democracy. He became negative and positive reference simultaneously, a mirror reflecting ideological predispositions. Beyond institutional debates, his story entered cultural imagination. Novels, essays, and historical dramas portrayed him alternately as fanatic, ascetic saint, tragic idealist, or cold bureaucrat of death. This multiplicity underscores the difficulty of reducing complex figures to single dimension. Robespierre was not driven by personal luxury or dynastic ambition, which complicates simplistic tyrant archetype. Yet absence of selfish motive does not neutralize destructive outcome. His case forces reconsideration of relationship between intention and consequence, between sincerity and impact. The ethical problem he embodies is acute. If a leader believes genuinely that severe action prevents greater catastrophe, how should history evaluate that belief? Intent mitigates some judgments, but not all outcomes. Robespierre's defenders argue that without decisive repression, the Republic might have collapsed under foreign invasion and internal rebellion. His critics counter that repression deepened divisions and undermined legitimacy. Both positions contain plausible elements. Yet perhaps the deeper lesson lies less in empirical calculation and more in structural insight. Systems that depend upon constant identification and elimination of internal enemies generate escalating thresholds. Because elimination reduces opposition temporarily but increases fear structurally. Fear incentivizes preemptive action, and preemptive action normalizes suspicion. Once normalized, suspicion requires continual reinforcement. This cycle can stabilize in the short term, but destabilize in the long term. Robespierre's fall illustrates this dynamic vividly. The logic he applied to rivals was applied to him when confidence in his stewardship faltered. Thus, his legacy operates as demonstration of how revolutionary virtue can become self-consuming. Yet it also demonstrates the power of moral language to mobilize populations under crisis. He spoke not merely to interests, but to ideals, and ideals inspire sacrifice. The challenge is ensuring that inspiration does not override pluralism. In modern political discourse, echoes of his language persist whenever leaders claim unique insight into collective good. Whenever opposition is framed as corruption rather than disagreement. Whenever emergency is invoked to justify suspension of ordinary norms. These echoes do not imply direct inheritance, but reveal recurring structural temptation, the aspiration to align state and morality completely. Robespierre sought unity between virtue and governance. Yet human societies are heterogeneous, composed of competing values and imperfect actors. Governance therefore requires negotiation, and negotiation appears messy compared to purity. His life highlights this tension starkly. He rejected mesensis in pursuit of coherence, and coherence enforced rigidly produced fragility. Historians continue to debate whether his severity was contingent response to extreme crisis or expression of personality predisposition amplified by context. Likely it was both. Crisis magnified traits already present, and traits shaped interpretation of crisis. This interaction between personality and environment remains central to understanding political radicalization. Robespierre's seriousness, forged in childhood disruption, found stage in national emergency. His incorruptibility insulated him from temptation, but also from corrective feedback. And insulated power drifts toward abstraction. The enduring relevance of his legacy lies not in guillotines, but in governance dilemmas. How to defend a system without hollowing its principles. How to pursue justice without equating dissent with danger. How to maintain moral conviction without monopolizing virtue. These dilemmas remain alive wherever politics engages with ideals. Robespierre's life provides neither simple condemnation nor simple vindication. It provides case study in intensity, in the transformative and destructive capacity of conviction, and in the precarious balance between righteousness and restraint. The revolution moved beyond him, yet the questions he crystallized continue to circulate, shaping debates about emergency powers, ideological purity, and the moral limits of political action. Thus, the incorruptible persists less as person and more as paradox. A figure whose commitment to virtue both inspired and unsettled, whose fall warns against concentration, yet whose resolve continues to fascinate those who believe history advances through uncompromising will. And in that fascination lies the continuing power of his legacy within revolutionary thought. The story of Maximilien Robespierre does not end at the scaffold. It lingers in the uneasy space between intention and consequence, between virtue and violence, between the dream of justice and the reality of power. He began as a lawyer who defended the marginalized, a man who believed deeply that humanity could be elevated through law, through reason, through moral clarity, and he ended as the most feared figure of a revolution that sought to remake the world. He did not crave luxury. He did not seek personal empire. He sought purification. And in that pursuit, he crossed the invisible boundary where protection becomes domination, where justice becomes acceleration, where certainty becomes isolation. His life forces us to confront a question that refuses to fade. Can a republic defend itself without becoming what it fears? Can virtue survive when armed with absolute authority? Or does power inevitably distort even the most disciplined conscience? Robespierre believed that terror was an instrument of justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. Yet history suggests that instruments rarely remain neutral in the hands of conviction. They shape the wielder as much as the wielder shapes them. The serious child of Arras, who once sought order against chaos, discovered that societies are not equations to be solved, but organisms to be balanced. Fragile, plural, imperfect. His incorruptibility was real, his commitment sincere. Yet sincerity does not shield a nation from the consequences of rigidity. And moral purity, enforced without restraint, fractures the very community it seeks to unify. As the summer of 1794 closed and the guillotine claimed its architect, France did not abandon liberty, but it learned, painfully, that liberty cannot be secured by fear alone, that equality cannot be imposed without cost, that revolutions require not only courage but limitation. Robespierre remains neither pure villain nor pure hero. He is something more unsettling. A mirror held to every age that believes it possesses final moral clarity. A reminder that the line between guardian and tyrant is often drawn not by motive but by method. His silence in death contrasts with the force of his words in life. And perhaps that silence is the most enduring lesson. Power speaks loudly, but its consequences echo longer. The revolution moved forward, empires rose and fell. Ideologies ignited and extinguished, yet the question he embodied persists wherever politics seeks perfection. How far can a society go in the name of virtue before virtue itself is lost? The blade has long since fallen. The quicklime has long since settled. But the debate remains alive. And as long as humanity pursues justice with intensity, the shadow of the incorruptible will remain. Not as command, not as prophecy, but as warning. That the road to a better world must be paved not only with conviction, but with restraint.